I'd like to thank the organising committee and the conference committee for the invitation to come to this conference. First time I've been to this conference, and I really enjoyed the interaction so far, and certainly the hospitality of the Japanese has been first class, so thank you very much. This presentation is probably more to the right of Walter's presentation in terms of a theoretical perspective, and it stems from an interest that I have had for a decade or so, and probably many of you have had as well, and that is to look at what evolutionary forces are at play in terms of field sports in particular, but sports in general, but obviously I'll concentrate on field sports here. So why are sports changing and how they're changing, and are there any common elements driving that evolutionary change? So all sports change, all sports evolve, and it's interesting when you look at some of the rules that obviously are one of the things that can drive sports to evolve. Rule changes. Golf started with I think just a handful of rules and now has several hundred. The AFL, which I'm most familiar with, started with 10 rules and now has more than 360. But they're old, you know, more than a century old, and you know, expect changes from time to time. And they build up over time, and so that's why you have hundreds. But even in a sport like mixed martial arts, and I'm not a huge fan of that, but I know when it started a decade ago, it's felt relatively recent. I think they had 3 rules, and now that's increased by tenfold, and there's something like 36 rules. So sports evolve. One of the reasons they evolve are rule changes, but there are other reasons as well. And part of it is the attention to detail of training. There may be nutritional advances, obviously improvements in skill acquisition, the rehearsal hours and so forth go up. So there are lots of things that perhaps influence evolutionary change. I'm going to look at evolution in 3 sports, and in particular I'll try and concentrate on the following variables that I've used to quantify, in a sense, what is a difficult thing to quantify, and that is how sports are changing. I use a metric of ball speed. One of the things we need to do when we look at how sports evolve is to go back and look at video recordings of sports. You can't go back in time, obviously, and measure individual players, and it's really difficult to get much written reports, many written reports of training schedules even. So that's in the last couple of decades, let alone if we go back 40, 50 years or more. So we look at ball speed, and we can get that through video analysis and some basic assumptions. We also look at something else that we can get from video analysis, usually because the television follows the ball almost invariably, although more and more recently they tend to have replays that annoy me, probably make everybody else happy, but sometimes the game starts and so you miss small sections of it. So we look at something called player density, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail, but it's pretty obvious. It's the number of players around the ball. And then a variable called physicality, which I doubt exists in the dictionary, I'm not sure, but our commentators in the AFL use it a lot, and so I've adopted that term, physicality. How much physical contact is there in a sport, and for things that we can measure, such as tackles and collisions and so on. First of all, just a little bit on methodology, a little bit more on methodology in terms of measuring movements and game demands. I've already mentioned that we use video analysis, and for that we use computer-based tracking. So the computer-based tracking is a mechanical method. It gives us reasonable measures, but there is obviously inbuilt error, and expertise is required, so a lot of practice is required to get reliable data, and also some GPS data. I'll present more modern aspects of evolutionary change based on GPS measures. So the first sport I'd like to talk about is soccer. We looked at, with all of these sports, it's important when you look at how evolution is operating, it's important to look at the highest level of sport that there is. So for soccer, you look at the World Cup. For Australian football, you look at the final series or home and away series at the AFL level. That's the top level national competition we have. And for rugby union, which is the other sport, I looked at World Cup rugby union games as well. But the higher the level, the less influence you have from other aspects like motivation and those sort of things. So we looked at the highest level, and in soccer it was the World Cup. We looked at, in the first instance here, game speed. We looked at the finals of each of the last 12 World Cups, including last year. Now, some people would argue, well, there's not a lot of games when you just look at the final of the World Cup, and that's true. We have 12 games, and you know, if we looked at games that were separated by a week or 4 weeks or 4 months, then you could argue that there's perhaps not enough time for things to change. But when you've got 4 years in between, you tend to be able to pick up patterns. And whilst you can't use this information on a week-to-week basis to improve performance, it's the sort of information perhaps interests people for the sake of what's happening in sport, but also maybe for talent identification, for the future of sport. It helps administrators in terms of rule changes and safety of players and those sort of things. And certainly it interests the media who want to build in and need to build in their adverts and things like that. So when we look at game speed, it's pretty obvious that game speed has over time, and this is 40 years or so, over time has increased in soccer. Soccer is increasing in speed, and this is the ball speed, remember, not the player speed. But it's important to mention here that in general, the studies that we've done looking at the relationship between ball speed and player speed, that there is generally quite close coupling of that. It can be in some situations uncoupled, where the ball can move very fast without the players moving fast. And particularly if you've got a skillful team and the ball doesn't touch the ground in AFL, or in soccer would be the equivalent, with longer passes to players that are free, perhaps. But generally, there is a close association. High speed in games, when we're talking about the ball, generally is associated with high speed player movement. One of the things we've also noticed is that when you look at the percentage of time that the ball is in play in most sports, and I'll only mention 3 today, but in 2 of the 3, the percentage of the game as playtime, that's when the ball is in play and there's competition and the referee or the umpire doesn't have control of the game. Or has control of the game, hopefully, but hasn't stopped the play. In this graph, you can see quite clearly that, and you'll notice obviously in the 12 World Cups we've got 24 points. So I've split it into halves for the sake of increasing the number of dots. You can see that halves differ a little bit, but the general trend is the same, that over 40 odd years, the percentage of the game as playtime has dropped from about 70% of the total time that is officially the time of a soccer game, down to about half of the time that you pay for when you go and watch, or you watch it on TV. Only about half that time is where the ball is in competition. And the other half is where the referee has control of the ball, or the ball is out, or it's getting set up for a free shot goal, and so on. And soccer is not unique in this regard. I'll show you AFL, but you think 50% is pretty low, and over almost exactly the same time period in the AFL, from 1961 to about the year 2000, it dropped almost identically from about 70% down to about 50%. But in the NFL in America, the play time of the total game time is about somewhere between 15 and 20%. So there are long breaks, there are long opportunities for players to recover. And it affects, therefore, the type of player that might be suited to the game. If there's not so much play in a game, then perhaps the physiology and the energy systems may be different compared to when the game is more continuous and there's more play time. So how come the game is, how we have less play time now in the World Cup soccer than previously? Well, it's to do with, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with these sorts of occurrences, that they're happening. You may not have the actual data and the thought to record it, but in terms of just measuring the time that these things take, for an average throw-in over the last 12 World Cups, you can see that there's been a slow increase, a significant increase, but a slow trending up. And you mightn't think that's a very significant from a practical point of view, a very significant change from an average of 6 seconds to an average now of 11 or 12 seconds. But that's twice the recovery that a player gets on average when there's a throw-in. You add that to the increased recovery time that you get for a corner kick, which has also gone up. The average of all free kicks combined, no matter where on the field, if you look at those free kicks, they've also gone up significantly. Goal kick has also gone up over time as well. In particular, and we are all familiar with this because this is, well, it's exciting, and perhaps that's why it's gone up. And that is on the right side there, the time it takes for set shots for goals. Obviously, there's a high proportion of goals scored from set shots. There's a greater probability of scoring from a set shot compared to general play. So set shots are important in the game, an important part of the game. And now, over the last 12 World Cups, we've seen an increase of almost threefold, or about threefold, in terms of the time taken to have a set shot for goal, which now averages over a minute before the play is restarted. So that's a minute of recovery. When you think of your elite players and their opportunities for recovery, we've only got half the game now as play. We've got long breaks, and of course they have an increased opportunity to recover, ready to start play. If we look at Australian football is played on a larger field than soccer, so it's really no surprise then that distances covered are greater than your average distances in soccer or hockey or rugby or smaller fields. We looked at games, as I said, from 1961, again using video recordings that were available. In fact, there are some games, although there are only sections of games that are available in Australian football back in, I think the earliest we found was 1909. But it's pretty average sort of video footage, and there's not much you can get from it. So from a full game point of view, from 1961 on. This is the ball speed in Australian football. And in a similar way to soccer, you see that the ball speed has increased. Now, I should point out that a number of these dots are single games. For example, 1961, 71, 81, I think 97 are single games, and others that are clustered up the end, more recent decades, are averages of the whole season. So not every game, I should say, but 22 games representing one game per week. So some are single games and others the average of 22 per season. But it's clear that the speeds have also increased significantly in Australian football and doubled in speed.